There's diversity across Asian Americans, and certainly in terms of vertical features. So I'm just wondering, does it work for me to stand behind the laptop? All right, thank you. Thank you, friend. I want to thank Dr. Dean Erickson, my good colleague and friend, Jessica Chen Fang, all the leaders and staff of the Asian American Center. It is such an honor to be invited here today. My name is Lana Kim, and I am an associate professor and program director of the Marriage, Couple, and Family Therapy Program at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon. I administrate the program, I teach, I supervise, I see clients, and I am so excited to share just a piece of that today as I respond to Dr. Hall's lecture. Before I express some appreciation actually to Dr. Nagayama Hall for his work, I just wanted to appreciate all of the participants, certainly Dr. Soong-Chan Ra, for the really touching and moving chapel service yesterday that highlighted solidarity for us in the Asian American diaspora, as well as across, far-reaching across our BIPOC sisters and brothers. The other piece that I want to acknowledge is just how deeply moved I have been to experience an extension of so many Asian relational ethical practices. The cutting and serving of the fruit, the questions of have you eaten yet? I went back to my hotel room and could hear my grandmother's voice that she would ask everybody the same question when they came to our home, which was, 밥 먹었니? 와서 밥 먹어라, which is, have you eaten? You know, that was a way of really showing love and care. And so I really feel deeply welcomed and cared for, and I just want to thank you, regardless of how that was shown. I want to thank Dr. Nagayama Hall for sharing such a thought-provoking and inspiring lecture on changing historical disparities. And I love that. It's not just mental health disparities, but it's changing historical disparities, increasing the personal relevance of psychotherapy for Asian Americans. Not only is it a privilege and honor to have this opportunity to learn and respond to Dr. Nagayama Hall's research and work, it is so meaningful to get to do this during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month and Mental Health Awareness Month. I mean, that to me is just... Dr. Nagayama Hall's lecture invites us to deepen our consciousness regarding AAPI positionality and lived experiences in the United States. It offers insights regarding the status of mental health disparities. And more so, his work invites us to revision the future, to be one that is more inclusive, accessible, and equitable for present and future generations, like your granddaughter, Emiko. Dr. Nagayama Hall, as an Asian American leader in the field of psychology, I appreciate the landmark contributions you've made to the field and the Academy. Your dedication to increasing awareness about AAPI diversity and improving the lives of your fellow Asian Americans in this country is a gift. You're amongst the scholars that work to ensure Asian Americans are seen and known in our shared society. And if we don't create our own platform for it, nobody else will. Contrary to racist stereotypes, Asian Americans are actually not voiceless, but we are often sociopolitically overlooked and deliberately ignored. Therefore, the progress we see today around increasing Asian American visibility would not be possible without the work of scholars like you. Your body of work has paved the way for other Asian American colleagues like me to also engage in research and practices that promote mental health and wellness within our Asian American communities. So I thank you. There are innumerable noteworthy points to draw from in Dr. Nagayama Hall's lecture. However, this is a brief response. So, as a family therapist, practitioner, and scholar, I will focus on discussing the factors Dr. Nagayama Hall outlined that contribute to mental health disparities through a relational and systemic lens. I'm going to end my commentary about continued directions for a shared psychotherapy field. I also want to acknowledge that the perspectives I present are admittedly filtered through my lens and social location as a second-generation Canadian-born, I'm sort of Korean-American by proxy, Korean-Canadian cisgender woman who was raised in a multi-generational immigrant family. My parents immigrated in like 1970, so the version of Canadian culture that I learned from there is one that I think our presenter shared about yesterday, which is sort of frozen in time. That's the version of Korean that I know. With this said, as presented in yesterday's lecture by Soon-Chan Ra and Tim Sang, the term Asian American is a political one that really emerged out of activism. Yet it often falsely assumes the centrality of East Asian identities and experiences at the exclusion of Southeast and South Asian communities. I acknowledge this inequity and want to be mindful that the ideas I present may not be representative or resonate fully with all. There is much complexity, nuance, and diversity amongst our Asian American experiences in the US. I should also contextualize that I'm most familiar with presenting on Asian American realities and experiences in white majority or white dominant places and spaces. As such, I often language concepts in the third person. So I say things like Asian Americans da-da-da, or I say they da-da-da, when it's really we or me. And so today I am intentionally choosing to use language that centers us and our lived realities. It's time for us to take space. I mean to refer to any persons who hold Asian American as one of their many identities. So please know that this is an intentional act of resistance to my own internalized racism that has taught me to defer to the centrality of whiteness. Asian American diversity is where I'd like to begin. I want to highlight the point that Dr. Nagayama Hall makes about the wide diversity of Asian Americans that dominant discourse often fails to notice. When you look at the broad body of literature, particularly in mental health, certainly in family therapy, as it relates to Asian Americans, it tends to really sort of create this monolith and static narrative. We are the fastest growing race in the US, having doubled our population over the past 2 decades. Within the racial category of Asian American, there are more than 20 plus ethnicities identified and a ton of intra and inter-ethnic diversity across birthplace, generational status, nativity status, migration legacies. Add on top of this the wide spectrum of intersectionality across socioeconomic class, education, occupation, sexuality, gender, ability status, spiritual orientation, I mean, you name it. So in short, what I'm trying to say is that contrary to racist stereotypes, Asian Americans do not look and are not all the same. And we get this all the time, right? For those of you who have had that experience. I mean, you know, we just completed our most recent interview round for admissions. And, you know, during the faculty Q&A, there was one applicant who looked at me and said, Dr. Yang, da-da-da-da-da. And you know, it's not an uncommon moment. So I sat there and I thought, oh, I'm kind of embarrassed for you, but that's okay. But I got that what they were doing is they were referring to me as like Sandra Oh from the character that she plays on Grey's Anatomy, you know? And so in that moment, I felt just an overwhelming sort of bubbling up sense of embarrassment for this student. But I was like, oh, I think we need to expand the relationships we directly have with people who are not us, right? To be able to step out of that. With such wide variability in ethnic subgroups and subgroups within subgroups, there is tremendous differences in cultural beliefs, practices, rituals, values, ways of thinking, feeling, being, relating. The context and regional cultures across the US also really vary from coast to coast, region to region, and everything in between. So this adds yet another layer to the version of culture that we perform. We all perform a version of culture that is unique. Furthermore, for many of us, whether we're first, 1.5, second, third, or fourth generation, many of us live and view life through a multicultural lens, with folks varying to the level to which they even connect and identify with the culture of their ethnic heritage. So as Dr. Nagayama Hall stated, while efforts to increase help-seeking behaviors amongst Asian Americans has included attending to culture and increasing the sense of personal relevance of mental health services, even as sophisticated as Wei-Chin Wang's adaptation model is, culturally adapted interventions that work for one ethnic group cannot be assumed to work for all Asian subgroups. While not meaning to preach to the choir, it's important to reiterate that culture is not static or monolithic, it's dynamic and ever evolving. It goes through different revisions and iterations given the ever-changing landscape of society. For those who resonate with social constructionist epistemologies, sociologists like Berger and Luckman back in the 60s remind us that reality is constituted through language and interaction, but always within context. The thing about context, it's always changing. In Dr. Ra's lecture yesterday, when he spoke about the idea that in immigration, culture and language often get frozen in time, for those of us who have experienced immigration directly or lived through it through the migration legacies handed down to us in our families, we know that any version of ethnic culture no longer exists tomorrow, right? The version that exists today is today's version. It will be revised, and it is revised. As Ivy and Ivy's aliquots metaphor illustrates, we are often impervious to how deeply ingrained culture and socialization can be because culture is like air. You just breathe it in. You don't even know you're doing that. So this reminds us that we're immersed in sociocultural ideas, ideologies, and discourses constantly, and we reproduce them, oftentimes unbeknownst to us unconsciously. I have a friend who once told her 8-year-old daughter that her mom, I'm older than Google. And her daughter's head just literally sort of broke open in that moment. You know, she is a child who is growing up in contemporary times where it is technology focused. So to imagine a world where Google doesn't exist to her was absolutely unfathomable. Culture's not imbued just in the things or the actions that we take. They get baked into the ideas that we live out. I'd like to now shift to discussing Dr. Nagayama Hall's explication of Asian American mental health disparities. So how many people were actually surprised by the statistic that Dr. Hall shared from the meta-review by Smith and Trimble that examined cross-racial rates of mental health utilization across 130 studies, which showed that Asian Americans demonstrate the lowest rates of mental health seeking utilization across BIPOC groups and the dominant majority. So show of hands, how many were surprised? Okay, so thank you for indicating your surprise. It looks like the vast majority of us were not surprised by that. That alone, really, we should sit with that for a minute and sort of reflect on that. We're not surprised by that because we know the realities. Asian Americans seek out mental health services at half the rate that their white counterparts do so over a lifetime. Furthermore, Asian American mental health utilization rates are still the lowest cross-racially. Asian Americans who have the privilege to pursue higher education might have greater sort of exposure to the ideas of psychology, mental health, therapy, what have you. They might tend to maybe seek more services, but still by and large, psychoeducation alone is not what increases utilization. Sobering research suggests that untreated mental health issues over the long term can contribute to public health issues. It can contribute to a multitude of issues ranging from relational issues, occupational issues, physical health issues, and acute issues such as substance abuse problems, acute violence, intimate partner violence, increased suicidal risk. Suicidal risk is a documented public health issue that is on the rise both domestically and abroad. The idea, though, that some groups might not utilize services because they're just more mentally healthy also is not true. It is false to assume that just because Asian Americans are not utilizing services, that they don't need them. So why aren't they seeking them? There are a number of factors ranging from larger, global, sort of systemic, to cultural, familial, and personal. I won't discuss all of these, but I'm going to highlight a few. And these are the ones that I most commonly see in practice. Systemically speaking, Dr. Hall stated that one reason for the disparity is that mental health issues and realities are largely invisible. This dovetails with kind of the overarching racialization and invisibilization of Asian Americans in society at large. Asian Americans are othered and oftentimes disregarded as full members of US society through this dehumanizing sort of model minority forever foreigner trope. So Asian American issues are either overconflated with ethnicity and culture or misunderstood because they're minimized and ignored. When we say that there's a lack of awareness regarding Asian American realities, we are directly talking about the impact of racism while we are inadvertently internalizing it also in some way. In the white and black racial binary through which racism is typically negotiated in the US, racism and its deleterious effects on Asian Americans is only beginning to be acknowledged today. And arguably, still it is only more blatant forms of anti-Asian hate that are acknowledged, while the sort of nuanced microaggressions that we experience day to day fly under the radar. The prescriptive way in which Asian Americans have been reductionistically expected to just be high performing, pretend that it doesn't matter, yet the perpetually foreign sort of ideology that we are adjacent to our white counterparts disregards the complex layers of the Asian American intrapsychic and sociocultural perspective. Cultural barriers can also serve as systemic barriers. Not being able to access services and languages, as Dr. Hall pointed out, can account for why a person might not seek services. A person's first language is their heart language, and there are many terms and concepts that don't translate directly because they're tied and connected to the context of which they come. In addition, much of the contemporary psychology and mental health therapy was born out of Western thinking. So from a traditional Asian cultural perspective, the idea of even mental health service and therapy might be misaligned. For many, from a cultural perspective, pain and trauma are oftentimes thought of in terms of spiritual or physical experiences and managed through body practices, food and nutrition, substance use, or just not talked about. Many psychotherapeutic models also view identity and experience through an individualistic lens that treats the individual at the individual level. How many times can I say individual? From a family systems lens and a culturally responsive lens, individualistic models leave out the nuance of our highly relational and sociocultural interdependent existence. We talked about face shame, and that really needs to be emphasized. Common to the Asian American experience, the shame or threat of losing face or social reputation and disconnection from one's family, group, or community is perhaps the biggest barrier to help seeking. Shame might be a universal human experience, but sociocultural context profoundly shapes its meaning. So while mental health services may threaten face, the pressure to maintain face also contributes to mental health issues. Dr. Shea, in her doctoral studies, did what I believe is really groundbreaking research. She took the focus of what Brené Brown does on individual notions of shame and looked at shame through a relational and emotional process. So what she was doing is challenging the dominant discourse assumptions that shame is an internal experience and said that shame is actually negotiated in the spaces between the relationships that most matter. She also differentiates between three types of shame. So what she said is that race identity shame occurs at the level of society. Face identity shame occurs at the level of family and community. Bicultural identity shame exists at the level of I. She posits that in Asian American family systems, awareness of face is actually adaptive. Orienting persons to align in a way to promote group harmony is actually not pathological. It is done to represent one's family and group in an honorable way, and that relational ethic needs to be honored. Face loss requires us to understand that in many Asian American family systems, social reputation is actually not simply lateral, it's also cross-generational. Because there is a tendency for in first and second generation families for children really to be the focus rather than the couple unit, what happens in terms of child outcomes is heavily focused on. It's watched. So children become a marker of parent success, and how children maintain face becomes an act of duty. The potential loss of face for any one person in an Asian American family system oftentimes impacts all the other parts of the system. It's bidirectional. To add to this, while this systemic process is an integral part of Asian American process, it's also pathologized by Western notions of healthy functioning. In my very first experiences of being a client in therapy, I did a lot of research to try to find a therapist who would be ethnically matched. I found somebody who was actually Korean American, and I was really excited and nervous for my first therapy session. I went to that session with the idea that I would hopefully feel felt. What happened in that brief one session experience, because I did not go back, was that after about 30 minutes, she handed me a psychoed resource. And she said, you know what, I think one of the problems is that you were raised in a codependent family structure. And so the pamphlet that she gave me was on codependency. I left, and this was about 20 years ago, maybe a bit more. I left sort of worried about what that meant. And so therein again was that miss of feeling, again, like cultural and ethnic matching didn't quite leave me with the feeling of feeling felt, and it pathologized Asian American family systems. Dr. Shea proposes face loss is connected to social consciousness, not just self-consciousness. Part of the bicultural Asian American experience is having to manage public and private identities across disparate social codes. And in a societal context that defaults to othering us constantly in racialized ways. When therapy is practiced through an individualistic lens that explores the internalization of shame, it obscures the fact that we are all relational selves. And I'm going to propose not just as Asian Americans, all of us are relational selves. Dr. Shea's work calls us to understand shame experiences from a sociocultural perspective, which can lead to increasing the sense of our clients leaving feeling felt. In terms of cultural adaptations, Dr. Nagayama Hall asserts that part of reducing mental health disparities as we move into the future means that we need to increase the sense of personal relevance or meaningfulness of mental health services and treatments. As I learned about Dr. Nagayama Hall's research around problem-solving approaches and developing this Mind Boba app, I got really excited. He suggests that problem-solving approaches are a version of cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's more culturally responsive to what research suggests matters to Asian American persons who might want pragmatic resources or something that's a little bit more directly applicable. His Mind-Boba project builds off of neuroscience, which shows activity in the medial prefrontal cortex when something holds personal relevance to a person. So the app is not a one-size-fits-all mechanism, which I love. I also love the graphic of the panda. I also love the thought of drinking boba tea. And I thought, what if a person is using Mind-Boba as an app, drinking boba tea in a boba shop? I mean, the opportunities for this are endless. This app is not a one-size-fits-all mechanism that prescribes particular outcomes. It works to enhance relevance at the individual level in a culturally responsive way. A person can select the issues they want to problem solve and build steps around tangible change. The pragmatic focus of this app is one that I believe holds great potential for the future, and I'm excited to see where this work leads. Now, when considering process-oriented therapy, which is sort of where I sit in that wheelhouse, I want to problematize the colonizing nature of therapeutic theories. Evidence-based treatments have not reduced mental health disparities as Dr. Hall pointed out, because oftentimes the evidence-based treatments have been normed on the dominant discourse population, which are white persons and whiteness. So what it does is then reify dominant discourse ways of how we should think, feel, be, how we should relate. And this can result in a person who receives that treatment not feeling connected to the work and maybe even feeling like, this therapy is probably not for me, and then maybe discontinuing therapy prematurely. In order for therapy to feel like it is for a person, they need to feel connected to it more tangibly. As mentioned previously, a core idea in family therapy is that therapy has to get people in their relational sociocultural context. When I'm working with my trainees and they are talking about interventions, and I feel like that's sort of happening in a rushed way, I say, hang on, who are your clients again? Tell me who they are. What do they do for a living? What are their names? What's the time, place, space that they're doing their life? Tell me about their relationships. We need to get all of that and really get the society that they live and move through in order to do therapy that's going to have any relevance. So regardless of a therapist's race, there's a tendency for all of us to learn what Dr. Kenneth Hardy, a thought leader in family therapy, calls we all learn to be pretty good white therapists. And I think I learned to be a pretty good white therapist. And now, as an educator and researcher, I try to help my therapy students, be therapists as who they are in the fullness of their identity. I don't want you to be a pretty good white therapist. I want you to be a good therapist as you, with your histories and stories and legacies. Yeah. I had a trainee, and this is sort of where it came out. We had to have a lot of conversations to help her trust that she's welcome to move in that direction. She is Vietnamese American. She was working with a Vietnamese American client. And I was watching her sessions week after week in the supervision room. And what I noticed was that the client was talking so much about this duality of she was the only daughter in a sibling unit of 5, 4 brothers, only daughter, youngest. And they were talking a lot about their parents' affairs and the parents' care. She was talking a lot about feeling how, as the only female identified sibling in the family, I am expected to be responsible for direct, sort of feminine oriented, socialized caregiving tasks. And at the same time, I don't get to make the decisions about what that care looks like. I don't have a lot of influence on my older brothers who still view me as someone who takes orders from them. And she was talking about the distress that that was leaving her. And what the therapist was doing, anyone want to guess? Being a pretty good white therapist, or so she thought that's what she needed to do. She was asking questions that was really about sort of building the client's individual sense of empowerment. Be more assertive, force your opinion. And I thought, I'm her supervisor and this is what I'm helping to produce. Okay, let's think about this. So as she came back one day after her session, I sat with her and I said, tell me how you're working. What are you noticing? What are you paying attention to? What's influencing the way that you're working with this client? Because I'm curious about a couple things, but I want to know where you're starting. And as we talked about this, what I realized is that she was working from these models and from these like dominant ideas that part of a treatment goal is empowerment, but through a very individualistic lens. And I said, I want you to go back into the therapy room the next week. What I want you to get really curious about is just to be curious to know that you are Vietnamese American, she's a Vietnamese American person, you're both second generation, your experiences are probably widely different in a lot of ways. So get curious, what is your experience? And ask her, in your system, out of your brothers, tell me who you feel like you have the closest alliance with. Tell me who seems to say, you know what, I'm not sure about this. Can I get your opinion? Is there anyone in that system that does that? Ask about, right? And so how can we work within the context of that person's system? There's also usefulness in just kind of postmodern therapies in general, like narrative therapy, socio-emotional relationship therapy, and frameworks that really kind of bring in a socioculturally attuned family therapy framework. These approaches can truly help us to learn how to practice therapy and counseling from a place of humility, a place of responsivity, and a place that hopefully, again, will leave our clients feeling felt. I also believe that reducing mental health disparities and increasing service utilization rates for Asian Americans necessitates a shift from objectifying and pathologizing Asian American diverse ways of being and actually valuing qualities that we have learned to enact in our relationships. Quiet fortitude, that's actually strength. Attunement, consciousness of how you impact others. High levels of connectedness and commitment to relationships. These should be privileged and valued as counter-cultural resistance to individualism. As practitioners, we need to be critically conscious, to not hold and impose dominant discourse standards of relational structures and boundaries, because as Dr. Nagayama Hall pointed out, one size really doesn't fit all. Thank you.